It's nice to be reunited with my old friend Campbell. We worked together for several years, but we haven't seen each other in a while, so it's really a pleasure to be back here with him, but also to meet his colleagues and students, and it gives me a good feeling to know that he has so many people around him to talk to. I wanted to start by telling you a little bit about the poet Robert Creeley. You may know he spent a lot of time in Auckland. He's part of the Black Mountain School of poets in the U.S. Together with Charles Olson, Zukowski, a number of others. And he came here first in '74, and then he returned for a year at the University of Auckland in 1995. And I was reminded of him on my first morning here. I was in the park, or rather on your campus, and a dog came up and greeted me. And I was reminded that the poem that he wrote in '95 while he was here was called The Dogs of Auckland. And it was a poem about being an American who was disoriented by the city until gradually he began to commune with these dogs around the city. And there's a wonderful moment in it when he's involved in a sort of, what I would say almost a kind of interspecies study in which he says, I am the dog of Auckland. And I certainly have felt like the dog of Auckland most mornings since I've arrived here. But nonetheless, I take his point that there is the dog is the animal that I am to follow, as Derrida might say. So I start this talk thinking about study, and I hope that I will get back to that talk of study and about what Fred Moten and I mean when we speak about study. But I have to warn you that I don't have much time, and I have some ways to go before I get there. So if we don't get back to study, maybe we can talk about it in the question and answer period. Where I'd like to start, actually, is in Ferguson, in the United States, a place that has been in the news for you, as for us, I'm sure. Ferguson is the scene of a particularly notorious police killing of an unarmed African-American youth called Michael Brown. Are you vaguely familiar with that? It seems like it was a fairly global story, and I'm sure that it has its parallels here in Auckland. Now, that story's been explained in a number of different ways, and it's been analyzed quite a bit. It spawned a very large protest movement, a very impressive protest movement that's gone on longer in the United States than almost any protest movements, going all the way back to the Montgomery bus boycott. So it's a very impressive movement that was in some ways unanticipated, but maybe that's something that needs to be learned, that those movements are often quite unanticipated. Now, there's a number of ways we could look at Ferguson, as I say, and the way that I'm going to look at it in the brief time that I have here is perhaps a little bit different than how it's been generally portrayed. Of course, on the one hand, it's been analyzed as part of a long history, and it certainly is part of a long history in the United States of extra-state violence and state violence against black populations, principally, but also Latino and Aboriginal populations in the U.S., and part of a long history of settler colonialism that itself also was part of a kind of slave colonial capitalism. And it's certainly true that it has to be taken in that frame. But it also is, in a sense, something new, not just in the way that it spawned the movement, but also, I would say, in what it might represent as a change in the forces of antagonism in the United States. It's been pointed out, for instance, that the police have become more militarized and that they've been sold a lot of military equipment. Today, as you know, especially if you're working in an American context, as I know a couple of you are, even universities have SWAT teams. There are armored vehicles in many school districts now, and there have been a number of stories of rocket launchers and other things that have fallen into the hands of police officers. So there certainly is a militarization going on, but That's always going on to some extent in the United States. It's part of a long history of going back to the paddy rollers, the Klan, etc., of a armed white citizenry combining with a state force. But there is something that is new, even statistically. Last year, the number of deadly killings of so-called felons was up again in the United States, up to over 400, near 450 killings. At the same time, the murder rate in the United States is at a 20-year low, as is the rate of death of police officers. So we see these things pulling away, increased amount of use of deadly force in communities at the same time that there is manifestly less violence in those communities by most accounts. So there is something going on. It's not surprising people have tried to talk about it, and of course the most famous way that it's been spoken about is through the campaign called Black Lives Matter, which you may have seen as a kind of hashtag, and it was a grassroots effort to mobilize people around a sense of the dignity of human life. Fred and I have, without disparaging that campaign in any way, have been asked a lot about that, and pretty consistently, I've tried to say, I think he has tried to say in his way too, that there is a problem with the notion of Black Lives Matter. It is an appeal to a certain kind of individual rights which have always existed, essentially against the actual conditions of black people in the United States, Aboriginal people, etc. It's part of a long history of a kind of liberalism that only exists, I would say, by feeding off of the denial of such rights to others. So there's something contradictory in Black Lives Matters. On the other hand, Black Life Matters, or we might even say Black Life is a mattering, and it's been a mattering recently that has had I think a new form of opposition in it that's quite important. So the reason that I'm starting here in Ferguson is that in the brief time I have, I want to make an argument to you that for us to speculate with, which goes something like this: that today you can't really understand the university in its most generalized form without understanding logistics. And you can't really understand logistics without understanding race and ultimately what Fred and I would call blackness. That's the argument of the talk. How far into it and how much I can persuade you in the time I have remains to be seen. But I want to start by suggesting to you that what we're seeing in Ferguson might be worth reminding ourselves was a case in which jaywalking was punishable by death. And I'd say that that's not entirely incidental, even if I have to admit it's also partly symbolic. Some of you may know the history of jaywalking, but it's an interesting history. I don't know if they use that term in New Zealand. Do you use the term jaywalking? It's part of a transition from colonial capitalism to industrial capitalism in the United States. A jay was a country bumpkin, a rube, someone who walked down the street because he or she didn't know better. And as a result, there was a public campaign, but backed by the emerging automobile industry, to get people not to walk down the middle of the street. Because there was the beginning of a flow of traffic, the beginning of the streets becoming part of a set of grids that would underpin much of industrial capitalism. So that jaywalking had a significance in the period of transition. And I'd say that in a sense, that kind of travel, that motif of travel is becoming significant again in this period of what I'm going to call logistical capitalism. So how could we get to the point where jaywalking was punishable by death? Well, of course, we know all the reasons that that this kind of violence persists in the United States, and yet nonetheless, I do think there's something here that's worth us thinking about, maybe in a new frame, without imagining that those other things necessarily go away. And what I'm thinking about in particular is that there's a transition that goes on from industrial capitalism to what I'm calling logistical capitalism, which has a figure also, maybe not the jaywalker, but maybe the traveling salesman. And the traveling salesman is an interesting figure in a transition from an industrial capitalism, particularly in the United States, to something beyond that, something that I might like to call logistical capitalism. This traveling salesman is interesting because, first of all, there are a whole number of jokes associated with the traveling salesman, which have very much to do with the opening up of the areas of social reproduction to direct monetarization and to direct labor. They're normally portrayed as these moments in which a traveling salesman meets a girl or a woman on a farm somewhere who's still very much within the sphere of a kind of settler colonialism, in which she's either working on the farm or she's working in the private sphere of the home, etc. And this is the kind of rude awakening of another world in which some sort of innocence is lost and some kind of new form of capitalism invades literally into this settler condition. But there's another aspect to the traveling salesman, and that's what's sometimes called the traveling salesman problem, which you may know if you've had the misfortune to study too much logistics, or indeed get familiar with any number of operations management as well. Because the traveling salesman problem is a basic name for the problem of how to have an efficient movement of goods and people, a classic logistics problem. That traveling salesman figure, I would suggest, has gradually morphed today into the figure that I think is the figure of domination today, and that is the consultant. The consultant today is the bearer of the algorithm. And as the consultant moves, the algorithm moves with that consultant. And that consultant, in turn, produces and reproduces a certain new set of class relations. What do I mean by that? Well, in order to say a bit more about that and why it's important for the university, I have to say two things about, I think, what's changing in the economy and what has changed, and I'll have to do that briefly. One is there's a kind of objective way in which certainly something like the American economy has become more logistical. So, for instance, in the United States, the vast majority of states in the United States, the biggest job is trucking. So you're most likely to have a job as a trucker. The second biggest job in most states is secretary, and the third is programmer. Now, of course, these categories aren't very good. But even given the problems of the category of trucking, which includes all kinds of delivery, there's a way in which the American economy has a good deal of logistics in it, and behind that a good deal of the algorithm. And when that is coupled and doubled, as it is, with the financialization of the economy, something I believe Campbell will speak more about, we can get the sense of why a consultant might be the kind of figure of domination today, in the same way that I would argue that in industrial capitalism, the citizen was the figure of domination, and prior to him, the settler was the figure of domination in colonial capitalism. So this consultant, I think, has a lot to answer for, but he's hardly individually responsible for this. Partly what has happened, I think, requires a slight revision of our history of financialization, which I offer a little bit tentatively, given the expert next to me on this matter. But we have a tendency to think of financialization as having coming into the firm and been part of what breaks up the firm, reorganizes the firm. But in a way, I think that the road for finance is in fact prepared through a much more obscure set of processes that take place in business and that are particularly located in operations management. Are there any operations management professors in here? Because it could be trouble for me, but I'm nonetheless going to plow ahead. Well, operations management, there's a certain moment in operations management characterized by the Japanese term Kaizen, in which I would say a certain change happens in the labor process. And there's a shift in focus in which there's a new attention to the continuous improvement of the line. There's a new attention to, now this is always there, of course, there's always competition, there's always improvement, but there's a new attention, there's a new intensification in how the line moves, how it operates, and what it's capable of doing. Now this coincides with a number of important things, including the coming together of operations management and logistics, because it's all happening around the same time. But this attention to the continuous improvement of the line begins to shift focus away from products and onto the notion of how people can do things. And this eventually will lead to this confusion we have now where it's quite common to imagine that anybody can run any kind of business because they have an ability to improve it. But this starts in a very specific way, I would argue, with Kaizen. And it has very much to do with beginning to think about moving away from human resources. It's not the people who are important. Moving away from accounting and engineering, it's not the stuff that's important. The line itself becomes important. But as this line is becoming more important, it's also exploding. It's exploding firstly because logistics theorists and operations management people have begun to see that there's a complete line that goes in and out of the factory door and continues in both directions into society and into nature. And that line is beginning to be extended. It's all along it, it's being subjected to this continuous improvement and to this imperative to show new ways in which essentially one can speculate on the line. And it's that speculation on the line and what the line can do that invites finance, in my view, at the end of the 1970s, beginning of the 80s. Now, why do I go through all that, and what's the relation of that to the university or to what we're trying to do here? Well, what I'm suggesting, of course, is that the thing that I've been describing is essentially what's sometimes called the social factory, the way in which the assembly line now weaves its way through society as a whole and is no longer confined to individual firms, individual factories, etc. But more importantly, that social factory puts so much pressure on us because it's not just a matter of us now being responsible for connecting that line. And it's not just a matter that line, the assembly line itself, is essentially always unfinished now, which puts a tremendous amount of pressure on us. But it's also that we are not just responsible for connecting. We're not just responsible for linking it to the next person or the next thing. We're responsible for improving it. So you can't just pass an email along, you have to pass it along with a comment. So there's tremendous pressure that comes from this Kaizen being spread through society in this way, and also tremendous uncertainty because we never know when we're done, and because we are never done. And one of the things that the consultant has produced to the algorithm is a notion that the labor process is forever unfinished, and that the assembly line is forever unfinished, even as it weaves throughout. Now, that notion of work that's always unfinished, of the danger of never doing enough, of course, is new to some of us, but it certainly isn't new to some of the figures that have, that sit at the background of this talk. And particularly, it's not new to the indentured worker, to the slave, to the migrant, that there should be no end to the labor process and no notion of when it's ever complete. But more importantly, what logistics asks of us, logistical capitalism asks of us, is not that we continuously improve alone or connect alone, but also that we provide and we also demand complete and absolute access. Complete and absolute access. Complete and absolute access to ourselves, and that we demand of others that kind of access. That, more than anything else, is, for me, the reason that the figures who haunted in their struggles for liberation earlier forms of capitalism return with such a vengeance today. Because the ultimate figure both of liberation from this access and of the ultimate and of complete access itself was the African slave. And not just the African slave, but anyone who crossed the path of that particularly brutal moment, from Aboriginals who were enslaved to Asians who were indentured, etc. That notion of access, which is what logistics precisely demands of all of us again, is in that sense a very old form of exploitation and a very old form of domination. To me, jaywalking today is a form of sabotage. And in that sense, I'm not surprised that these forms of dissent are meeting with the most brutal kinds of responses from the state. Of course, that's all the more reason to struggle against that state. And I think that we're seeing that in places like Ferguson. But nonetheless, I would say that the kind of capitalism we're in now, one in which what's demanded of us is not only total connectivity, total flexibility, total translatability, but also total access to ourselves at every level, intellectual, emotional, relational, etc., is something that has long been resisted, and resisted most by those who have most been exploited and dominated by it. And it's for that reason that I think the way that we might try to understand the university today is by trying to get a sense of where it sits within this logistical capitalism. And I think we can maybe reach some interesting observations about the university doing it that way. Now, I'm aware that the university, on the one hand, and I've spoken about this, and I've also heard some really good stuff this week about it, needs to be understood still, and I don't deny this, as Polancis might say, as a kind of condensation of forces, and that in addition to that, there is an ongoing class struggle in the university. But I wanted actually to focus on that other aspect of the university that maybe is slightly less fashionable, and that's its role in domination, and what Althusser would call domination. I'm going to read you a very short quote from Althusser, just to set up this last part of my talk to you. Thank you. He says, he's talking about schools, and he says, what everybody also knows, however, that is, what nobody cares to know, is that alongside these techniques, reading, writing, arithmetic, and this learning, elements of scientific and literary culture that function as know-how, alongside but also in the process of acquiring these techniques and this learning, people also learn at school the rules of good behavior, that is, the proprieties to be observed by every agent in the division of labor, depending on the post he is destined to hold in it. These are rules of professional ethics and professional conscience, that is, to put it plainly, rules of respect for the social and technical division of labor, and in the final analysis, the rules of the order established by class domination. People also learn to speak proper French at school, to write properly, which in fact means, for future capitalists and their underlings, to order workers around properly, which in fact means, the ideal case, to talk properly to them so as to intimidate them or cajole them, in short, to con them. The literary curricula in secondary and higher education serve that end, among others. Put this in more scientific terms, we shall say that the reproduction of labor power requires not only the qualifications be reproduced, but the submissions to the rules of respect for the established order be reproduced at the same time. This means, for the workers, reproduction of labor power, submission to the dominant ideology, and for the agents of exploitation and repression, reproduction of its capacity to handle the dominant ideology properly, so as to ensure the domination of the dominant class verbally. So, with that in mind, that the university, in addition to being something that I think's been nicely covered at moments, a place of class struggle, a place where a lot of labor happens. It is also remains a place of where domination is reproduced, and it's interesting to think about what domination might look like for logistical capitalism. And I've been trying to think about this in the context of my own university, which Campbell mentioned, is Singapore Management University, which is in a sense quite a technical university, very concerned with business, very concerned with law, very concerned with accounting, economics, etc. And yet, it's in recent years, its emphasis has all been in these directions which make no sense on the surface that way. So, for instance, they've tried to reach 100% of their undergraduates going overseas at some point. They've created all kinds of creative lab spaces for these undergraduates who have no obvious interest in sitting in these spaces and playing on these beanbags. They've created all these spaces for them. And then most remarkably recently, they created what Althusser calls a literary culture. They've created a kind of humanities. In fact, that's the reason I'm there. And I would suggest that all of those things have to do with forms of domination, which are taking the form increasingly of demanding as well as providing access. And that this increased attention to travel, this increased attention to study that never ends and has no separation from the life of a student on a beanbag chair, and indeed this humanities curriculum, which does what the humanities curriculum has always done since the time of Kant, at least, which is reproduce a verbal domination, as Althusser would say. That these are all part of new forms of command that are necessary for those who intend to order around others in logistical capitalism, as well as to be subject to it themselves. And it's no longer enough merely to have professional ethics in accounting, but one must range out into these various forms of open access, to use the popular term. Now, I don't suggest that other things have necessarily gone away. As we know, primitive accumulation is still with us, and certainly industrialization is still with us, at least in my neighborhoods. But I do think that we are facing something quite new here in logistical capitalism, and that one of the reasons we can read its newness is the viciousness with which, for a long time, but now with increased attention, many communities are met who fail to provide this access, who fail to move in the right ways, who fail to let things pass through from the perspective of logistical capitalism, but from the perspective of communities and peoples who are involved in these kinds of struggles, are in fact, I think, showing us a way towards some sort of liberation from this logistical nightmare, as the popular term goes. So I'll end there because I understand we're trying to keep pretty strictly to time, and I've gone pretty quickly over a lot of material, and I'd be pleased to try to expand on anything that was worth repeating. Thanks.
I'd like to talk. There's a lot of moving parts. So I'm not quite sure where exactly to start, but I really am just wondering if you could articulate more what the line is constituted by. Is it information? Is it, I mean, you're calling it logistics, but what constitutes? Is it energy, money, or information, or is it all of these things, or is there a way we can pin this down somehow?
Yeah, I think I would say that the line is constituted by labor. So the line is constituted and reconstituted by us. What flows in that line and what we bring to that line in order to improve it, I think, are all the things that you're mentioning. This is sometimes understood today in national security discourse as critical infrastructure. Is the sort of heart of the identifiable lines moving through society. So on the one hand, what we're seeing is something that's just a continuation. We're seeing an increased laboring of the other circuits of production, as Marx would call it. So there's more labor going on in circulation, more labor going on in distribution, more labor going on in consumption and realization. But on the other hand, I think we're also seeing something different going on in production, which is why I think it's worth beginning to raise the question about whether we need to think of another way to talk about capitalism today. And what I didn't have time to go into, but maybe what I would partly suggest a notion of logistical capitalism is in opposition to is this idea that we entered some era of immaterial labor in which we're going to be working creatively and in which the model that we should have in mind is the student, the artist, the academic who has no division between work and life, etc. This is all a very and if you were in Chris's paper, you heard him give a very nice anecdote about a Google official who didn't think this was the way things were going either. But independently of that, from a political and philosophical point of view as well, I think that that notion that exploitation is going to be subject-based, it's always been and it remains a kind of elite notion, but I think is also simply false. Logistics isn't really interested in our personalities. And access precisely is about not giving a shit about your subjectivity. Which is why resistance to access or liberation from access is equally about not giving a shit about your subjectivity, would be, I wouldn't say my critique of Black Lives Matters, but why that's not the way that I would approach thinking about Black life as a force of liberation today.
Questions from Chris and Susan.
Yeah, thanks. That was really great. I like your concept of logistical capitalism quite a bit. I'm just wondering can you say more about the humanities in Singapore? Sure. I'm not sure whether you're seeing it as a contradictory space of class struggle, or if it's just the space of domination, teaching logistical tactics to people who are going to go on to deploy them.
I was quite struck by that comment that you quoted from the Google. Was he director of research or? Norvig, yeah, because I think that's what the government has in mind in Singapore. They have in mind that they want at least a percentage of their university population to be able to go into that world that is creative with other creatives. But I think, this was also raised in your talk, I think you raised this in talk, but Singapore also is perfectly happy for everyone else just to be in logistical capitalism. It suits them fine that most people aren't going to be creative and that there isn't going to be a struggle over their subjectivity at work, but rather that things are simply going to pass through them, and if they don't offer access, they're going to have trouble. So I think that's their idea of the humanities, and that they want to train a small group of people to have that as part of their ability to establish a class relation with others who are going to be doing logistics.
You don't see it as internally conflictual at all. It's pretty much just.
It's internally conflictual at the institutional level, for sure, because the second that they discover what the humanities actually is, right? Again, something that you've spoken about for a long time, Chris. As soon as they really discover what it is, they discover that it's dangerous. So for sure, I don't hold up, in the particular scenario we're talking about, I don't hold up a lot of hope that danger is going to add up to very much, but it definitely is yet another proof that you have to be careful what you wish for when you're talking about the humanities.
Just two reflections, one actually on Singapore and some of the interviewing I've done there. The frustration for the officials fundamentally is that they can't sort that line out straight enough at the moment. But it just occurred to me that the phenomenon of MOOCs, but not just MOOCs, the ways in which the particularly publishing companies like McGraw-Hill and others are involved in the governance of universities, but what they are doing essentially in these arrangements is generating analytical data. And I think the distraction with MOOCs is, at one level, is we kind of see this as a new learning phenomenon. I actually see it, if you look at the back end of it, it's actually about how you sort that line out so that you have a very clear sense of the straightness. It's almost kind of mainlining in, between the learner and how the textbook producers and so on figure out right to the eyeball movements, what they concentrate on, how long they concentrate, and so on. So this is where it's all going, and I think we get distracted by MOOCs as a different kind of phenomenon to what it is.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the breaking down of the body, the breaking down of affect, etc., is part of what logistics does in order to get access, in order to speed things up, in order to find ways to improve things. And I think that the student experience, certainly at SMU, but I think in a lot of places, increasingly has to do with beginning to get comfortable feeling like data, for instance. Already, as we know, students are accustomed to instant access to information in ways that also very quickly bleed over into their demanding that from others. And that's, I think, maybe part of the interesting class position of being students, especially at more elite universities like Auckland or SMU. And Auckland's more elite still, I would say. So I think what's happening in terms of that, Althusser separates these two things, the skills that need to be reproduced and the domination. But today, the way logistics works, most definitely not through the subject, we see that these things get blended, that there are all kinds of ways in which it's sometimes hard to say whether someone is being prepared to command others in logistical capitalism or is simply learning how to be more openly accessible. A good example of this in a very concrete ways is something like Alfred. Do you know what Alfred is? Alfred is this service that's really only possible with this kind of breakdown and opening up of the assembly line through society. And it's essentially what Alfred is people who have no jobs who agree to be just-in-time butlers for people who do have jobs. And this works on the one hand because we in places like the United States and Britain, we have this pulling away of a class that can do this, but it also works because people's lives become so scattered by trying to be effective on this assembly line, to try to be continuously improving that, of course, they can't manage their own lives. And at the same time, like logistical capitalism pushes out anybody who hasn't figured out how to offer enough access, and they become available to do this kind of Alfred Butler stuff. So just like the micro-tasking of the Mechanical Turk or something else, these are all sort of byproducts we can see that are flowing out of this kind of ridiculous Kaizen in the social factory that can't possibly be answered, and causes a kind of fracturing of society.
One last question, I think.
Yeah, I think I don't need to like. Yeah, I've been wondering all along. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to this idea of cognitive or logistical capitalism, but if we're all workers, so if we're all getting exploited, who is the dominant class?
Well, that's a nice question. And of course, there's a sociological way that's looked at through things like Davos and things, right? But that doesn't interest me very much. What does interest me is the way that domination operates when the people who are supposed to be able to consider themselves subjects are themselves broken apart by access and by logistics. So what I would say for you is what's interesting right now is that's a very difficult question. I think this is a reason that that we're seeing, I wouldn't say it's a reason, but part of what's going on with the humanities is that they can't reconstitute the subject because society won't have it. So I think it's a very interesting moment for that. Althusser is out of date in that sense, but I still want to talk about domination and the way it's produced in the university because I think that I think it's still a primary site for that effort. It's just that it's no longer necessarily distributed in bodies that in turn can think of themselves as individuals and as subjects in the way that it might previously have been.
realise there are a number of more questions, but I think we're going to need to wrap up question time. So please join me in thanking Stefano.